So the absolute most unprecedented, reality-shattering, and historically impossible alliance in the entire thousand-year history of the British monarchy has just been violently, secretly forged in the pitch-black dead of night, completely bypassing the incredibly nosy, heavily compromised global tabloid media and the frantic, desperate palace public relations machine. Because in a move that absolutely no one on the entire planet could have ever possibly predicted, Prince William and Prince Harry have allegedly officially ended their bitter, highly publicized, years-long blood feud to completely, ruthlessly unite against a single, incredibly dangerous common enemy, and the deeply terrifying, world-shifting reason behind this sudden, impossible reconciliation is a massive billion-dollar conspiracy, orchestrated directly by Queen Camilla that goes so incredibly deep into the dark, rotting core of the royal establishment that it fundamentally threatens to permanently destroy the entire sovereign institution from the inside out. If you have been obsessively watching the endless, exhausting, incredibly toxic royal drama unfold over the last 5 years, and wondering if the two warring brothers would ever finally realize that they were being deliberately, systematically played against each other by shadowy, incredibly powerful forces lurking deep inside the palace walls, you absolutely must buckle up and pay incredibly close attention to every single word of this breakdown. And you absolutely need to hit that subscribe button for Monarch Access right now as we mercilessly, completely pull back the heavy gold-trimmed velvet curtain on the absolute most explosive, legally terrifying, and masterfully executed counter-coup ever conceived in the modern history of global dynastic wealth. You have to actively, systematically deconstruct absolutely everything you think you know about the supposedly irreconcilable rift between the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Sussex, because the heavily manufactured, highly sanitized public narrative that they simply hate each other over petty family disagreements and incredibly harsh media leaks is actually nothing more than a brilliant, highly effective, deliberately constructed smokescreen designed specifically to distract the global public from a much darker, incredibly sinister financial reality that has been quietly, aggressively operating right under everyone's noses for the better part of a decade. The incredibly explosive, entirely cinematic sequence of events officially kicked off on a freezing, completely overcast midnight in London when a highly encrypted, deeply untraceable digital message was quietly, nervously transmitted from a deeply hidden, totally off-the-book server located inside the heavily fortified walls of Windsor Castle, directly to an equally secure, highly classified private network operating out of a heavily guarded estate in Montecito, California, containing absolutely nothing but a terrifyingly detailed, highly classified, 30-page forensic financial dossier and a single, chillingly urgent demand for an immediate, completely unrecorded, highly secure, face-to-face meeting on absolutely neutral, completely unmonitored territory. According to incredibly deep, highly vetted palace insiders who are actively risking their entire careers and absolute personal freedom to leak this explosive information, the horrifying contents of that encrypted digital dossier were so entirely devastating, so legally radioactive, and so completely undeniable that Prince Harry immediately, without a single moment of hesitation, silently boarded a completely unmarked, privately chartered luxury jet under the absolute highest level of incredibly tight, military-grade security, flying completely under the radar across the Atlantic Ocean to secretly land at a remote, highly classified private airstrip located deep in the English countryside, entirely bypassing regular customs and official royal protocols specifically to avoid tipping off the compromised, highly corrupt senior courtiers who effectively control the current king's daily schedule. Waiting for him inside a damp, completely isolated, centuries-old stone hunting lodge located on the extreme forgotten outskirts of the massive royal estate, was absolutely not a screaming, angry brother ready to reignite their incredibly toxic, highly publicized tabloid war, but rather a deeply exhausted, intensely serious, incredibly focused Prince William, who had completely dismissed his entire royal security detail, disabled all electronic tracking devices, and essentially gone completely, utterly dark for the absolute first time in his entire, highly monitored adult life, precisely because he had just made a terrifying, world-shaking discovery that proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the British crown was currently being systematically, aggressively, and entirely illegally dismantled and sold off piece by piece to the absolute highest bidders in the global aristocratic underworld. As the two estranged brothers stood completely alone in the freezing, dimly lit stone room, surrounded by absolutely nothing but silence and the overwhelming, suffocating weight of their shared ancient history, William slowly, deliberately slid a massive, incredibly thick, heavily redacted black leather binder across the rough wooden table, entirely stripping away years of deep, agonizing personal hurt, intense media manipulation, and bitter resentment to reveal the horrifying, unvarnished, completely documented truth. Queen Camilla had allegedly, systematically, and incredibly quietly constructed a massive, totally illegal, entirely invisible shadow monarchy, utilizing incredibly complex, deeply obscure offshore corporate shell companies, heavily corrupted international trust funds, and intensely loyal, highly paid mercenary lawyers to aggressively siphon billions of pounds in priceless, protected royal assets, historic, world-renowned real estate portfolios, and sacred, taxpayer-funded sovereign wealth directly into the private, entirely unmonitored bank accounts of her own civilian family members, and a terrifyingly elite, highly secretive cabal of corrupt aristocratic allies. The sheer, unadulterated, mind-numbing scale of the alleged massive financial fraud was absolutely impossible for either brother to fully comprehend at first glance, because Camilla hadn't just been stealing loose cash or redirecting minor charity funds, she had actively, ruthlessly exploited King Charles's rapidly declining health, his notoriously deep, crippling emotional dependence on her, and his total absolute refusal to believe that she could ever possibly betray him, to specifically, legally force through incredibly damaging, completely unauthorized changes to the core, foundational sovereign charters that legally govern the absolute transfer of generational wealth within the House of Windsor. According to the incredibly damning, undeniable paper trail meticulously gathered by a highly secretive, deeply loyal team of rogue MI5 forensic accountants who still fiercely honored the sacred memory of the late Queen Elizabeth, Camilla had expertly, brilliantly capitalized on the massive, highly publicized distraction caused by William and Harry's intense global media war, explicitly using the absolute chaos of their very public fallout as the perfect, highly effective smokescreen to quietly, methodically install her own fiercely loyal, heavily compromised sycophants into the absolute highest, most powerful, unchecked positions within the royal household's financial management division, entirely replacing the fiercely loyal, highly ethical legacy staff who had successfully, safely managed the crown's immense wealth for over 50 years. William quietly, intensely explained to his completely stunned, absolutely horrified brother that for the past 2 years, every single time the tabloids viciously, aggressively attacked Meghan Markle, or every single time a totally fabricated, highly damaging story was conveniently leaked to the British press about Harry's supposed disrespect for the institution, those incredibly toxic, highly distracting media leaks had actually strategically originated directly from Camilla's own fiercely protected, highly secretive private office, specifically, maliciously designed to keep the entire global public, the ravenous press, and the actual legitimate royal heirs completely, obsessively focused on hating each other so they would absolutely never ever notice that the literal, physical foundations of the monarchy were being actively, illegally dismantled and stolen right out from under them. The absolute terrifying realization that their entire agonizing, deeply painful family destruction had been actively, maliciously orchestrated and aggressively fueled by the exact same woman who had spent decades ruthlessly tearing apart their late mother's life was a completely devastating, absolutely unifying psychological earthquake for both brothers, instantly, permanently melting away all of their petty, manufactured grievances and completely replacing their years of bitter anger with a totally terrifying, incredibly cold, completely unified and utterly unstoppable rage. But the incredibly dark, horrifying depths of this massive conspiracy went so far beyond simple, greedy financial embezzlement or petty, nasty tabloid manipulation, because William then slowly, carefully opened the very last, most highly protected section of the black leather dossier, revealing a single, deeply fragile, incredibly ancient-looking piece of yellowed parchment featuring the unmistakable, instantly recognizable, highly authoritative signature of their late grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II herself, proving that the legendary brilliant monarch had actually remarkably anticipated this exact, terrifying apocalyptic scenario years before her death. The late Queen, possessing a terrifyingly sharp, absolutely unparalleled understanding of human greed and the deeply corruptible nature of the people surrounding her son, had secretly, quietly drafted a highly classified, legally binding, absolutely ironclad constitutional fail-safe mechanism, explicitly, legally decreeing that, in the absolute event of severe, undeniable financial corruption, massive institutional betrayal, or unauthorized, illegal asset stripping committed by a reigning consort, the two primary, biological heirs of the direct Windsor bloodline, William and Harry, must explicitly, unequivocally unite as a single, indivisible, constitutional legal entity, possessing the absolute, supreme, override authority to immediately, forcefully, and permanently strip the offending consort of all royal titles, entirely freeze all connected, corrupt financial assets globally, and immediately assume total, unchecked emergency operational control over the entirety of the Crown estate. This incredible, earth-shattering, hidden royal decree wasn't just a simple, sentimental letter from a loving grandmother. It was a highly weaponized, heavily legalized, completely unassailable constitutional kill switch designed specifically, surgically to completely bypass the king's authority if he was ever found to be entirely compromised, utterly incapacitated, or deeply, blindly complicit in the active destruction of the monarchy's incredibly sacred, thousand-year-old historical legacy. The only catch, the incredibly difficult, almost impossible, massive hurdle that the brilliant late queen had intentionally, perfectly designed into this flawless legal trap, was that the incredibly powerful, devastating constitutional override could absolutely never ever be legally activated by just one single heir acting alone, out of petty spite or personal ambition. It absolutely, legally, and fundamentally required the physical, undeniable, completely unified presence and the matching, certified legal signatures of both Prince William and Prince Harry standing together, shoulder to shoulder, presenting a totally unified, completely unbreakable front against the deeply embedded forces of massive corruption. Realizing the immense, terrifying, and profoundly heavy historical duty that had just been violently dropped squarely onto their shoulders, the two brothers, who had literally spent the last 5 years refusing to even make polite eye contact in public, stood completely silent in that freezing, incredibly dark room, looking deeply into each other's eyes and silently, instantly forging an absolute, unbreakable, totally terrifying blood pact to completely, mercilessly annihilate the massive network of corruption that had actively sought to destroy their family's sacred legacy. Over the incredibly tense, absolutely chaotic, and entirely silent next 48 hours, William and Harry completely bypassed the incredibly compromised, highly untrustworthy palace advisors, the overly cautious, risk-averse legal teams, and the deeply corrupted, sycophantic senior courtiers, directly, quietly assembling their own highly elite, fiercely loyal, completely off-the-book strike team composed entirely of top-tier, ruthless international constitutional lawyers, heavily armed, fiercely independent federal financial regulators, and elite, highly trained former military intelligence operatives who absolutely firmly believed in the sacred, untarnished preservation of the true, legitimate royal bloodline. They didn't frantically run to the screaming, messy tabloid press to leak the story for a quick, cheap, incredibly chaotic headline. They didn't throw a highly public, highly embarrassing temper tantrum on social media that Camilla's massive, expensive PR team could easily, effortlessly spin into another story about their supposed emotional instability. And they certainly didn't blindly, foolishly confront their heavily compromised, incredibly sick father in a noisy, useless shouting match that would accomplish absolutely nothing. Instead, they played a terrifyingly cold, brilliantly calculated, absolutely masterful long game, meticulously, flawlessly setting the ultimate, inescapable, highly public trap specifically designed to completely, humiliatingly corner Camilla in front of her absolute most powerful, wealthiest, and deeply complicit aristocratic allies. The explosive, world-stopping, entirely unprecedented climax of this completely invisible, incredibly high-stakes generational war spectacularly, violently, and poetically unfolded during an incredibly lavish, highly photographed, obscenely expensive, invite-only aristocratic philanthropic gala hosted directly by Queen Camilla herself inside the massive, historic, highly decorated Grand State Dining Room of Buckingham Palace. An event she had personally, arrogantly orchestrated specifically, loudly to publicly celebrate her own total, unquestioned, absolute dominance over the massive family empire, and to essentially permanently crown herself as the absolute greatest, most successful, totally untouchable power broker in the entire history of the modern British dynasty. Picture the incredibly tense, overwhelmingly cinematic, heart-stopping scene. The grand, historic, sprawling ballroom is absolutely packed wall to wall with the absolute most elite, corrupt, powerful politicians, shady international billionaires, and highly complicit aristocrats on the face of the earth. The incredibly expensive, rare vintage champagne is flowing like a literal, unending river of wealth. The massive, priceless, incredibly heavy crystal chandeliers are blazing with blinding, pure light, and the incredibly smug, totally oblivious queen consort is standing proudly, arrogantly at the main gold-trimmed podium, bathed entirely in a sea of flashing, frantic cameras, delivering a highly sanitized, incredibly arrogant, deeply hypocritical, completely fabricated speech about the unbreakable unity, the flawless historical continuity, and the incredibly bright, totally secure financial future of her massive, stolen dynasty, completely, utterly oblivious to the terrifying, absolute fact that the very marble ground beneath her expensive designer shoes is about to completely, violently, and permanently collapse into dust. Just as the beaming, incredibly complacent, and totally arrogant queen proudly, slowly raises her expensive crystal glass for a massive, triumphant, incredibly self-congratulatory toast to her own supposed, highly manufactured brilliance. The heavy, ancient, towering, immensely thick oak doors at the very back of the sprawling, crowded, incredibly loud ballroom suddenly, violently, and aggressively burst open with a deafening, terrifying, room-shaking crash, completely unannounced and entirely unauthorized by her deeply panicked, totally overwhelmed private security detail. The entire massive room instantly, terrifyingly falls completely, incredibly silent as Prince William and Prince Harry, dressed in immaculate, perfectly tailored dark suits, slowly, purposefully, and incredibly intensely walk directly into the blinding, flashing light side by side, perfectly, flawlessly synchronized, flanked not by standard, polite, smiling party guests, but by a highly intimidating, completely unsmiling, heavily armed phalanx of elite federal marshals, senior international banking regulators, and the absolute top, most feared constitutional attorneys in the entire country, instantly, terrifyingly dropping the temperature in the massive room to absolute freezing as every single conversation, every single obsequious laugh, and every single clink of a glass abruptly, terrifyingly stops dead in its tracks. The two brothers absolutely do not shout, they do not frantically wave their arms in the air, and they do not cause a cheap, emotional, messy theatrical scene. They simply walk with absolute, terrifying, unyielding, machine-like purpose directly up the center aisle of the stunned, completely paralyzed ballroom. The wealthy, deeply terrified crowd literally parting before them like the Red Sea. Their incredibly cold, piercing, entirely unified eyes locked entirely, unblinkingly on the visibly paling, suddenly sweating, wildly trembling queen consort standing frozen at the podium. William is carrying absolutely nothing in his hands but a single, incredibly thin, unassuming black leather folder containing the certified, undeniable, fully authenticated original copy of the late Queen's constitutional override decree, alongside a massive, towering, incredibly heavy stack of freshly signed, legally binding, highly aggressive federal and international injunctions that explicitly, immediately, and totally froze every single one of Camilla's highly secretive offshore bank accounts, permanently locked every single property gate of her stolen real estate portfolio across the globe, and completely thoroughly stripped her of absolutely all executive, financial, and legal power she possessed within the Crown estate. When the two unified, absolutely unstoppable brothers finally slowly reached the absolute front of the dead silent, completely paralyzed, utterly terrified room, William calmly, deliberately, and with agonizing, terrifying slowness places the black leather folder directly onto the polished surface of the podium right in front of her, looks the incredibly terrified, hyperventilating, completely ruined woman dead in her shaking eyes, and quietly, ruthlessly, and incredibly evenly informs her, in a perfectly modulated, entirely ice-cold voice designed to carry just far enough for the entire front row of stunned, open-mouthed, heavily complicit billionaires to clearly hear every single devastating syllable, that her massive, fraudulent, highly illegal, and completely corrupt shadow reign over their family's empire is officially, permanently, and undeniably over. Harry, standing absolutely perfectly still beside his brother, his entire posture radiating an absolutely terrifying, incredibly cold, unyielding strength that completely shatters the weak, emotionally unstable caricature the tabloids had spent years desperately trying to paint of him, slowly leans incredibly close to the shaking, totally broken queen, and quietly, intensely whispers that she has exactly one single, fleeting hour to quietly, humiliatingly, and quickly pack her personal belongings and permanently, forever vacate the ancestral palace, before she is officially, publicly, and highly visibly escorted off the premises, in handcuffs by the waiting, heavily armed federal marshals, for massive, documented, undeniable historical fraud, grand embezzlement, and the highly illegal, deeply treacherous destruction of protected, sacred sovereign trusts. The sheer, unadulterated, suffocating, complete panic that instantly, violently washes over Camilla's sweaty, ashen, heavily made-up face is absolutely impossible to fake, because in that single devastating, entirely catastrophic millisecond of absolute terrifying clarity, she realizes with blinding, agonizing, world-shattering certainty that her incredibly expensive, highly paid, aggressive defense lawyers absolutely cannot save her. Her vast, carefully hoarded, illegally obtained billions cannot possibly buy her way out of the ironclad, unbreakable legal trap. And her deeply corrupt, meticulously constructed, totally arrogant, decade-long cover-up has just been spectacularly, flawlessly, and incredibly publicly dismantled by the incredibly powerful, lingering ghost of the late Queen Elizabeth, who had brilliantly, perfectly anticipated her exact, arrogant, greedy betrayal from beyond the grave. The deeply arrogant, incredibly powerful courtiers, the wealthy hangers-on, the heavily compromised politicians, and the high society sycophants who had literally just spent the entire lavish, obscenely expensive evening desperately, pathetically kissing her ring, laughing loudly at her terrible jokes, and profusely praising her fake, manufactured brilliance suddenly, physically, and instinctively begin backing away from her in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror, quickly realizing with ruthless, cold, self-preserving clarity that the absolute center of gravity in the room had just violently, permanently, and entirely shifted forever. and that publicly standing anywhere near the disgraced, completely exposed, utterly ruined fraud was tantamount to absolute, career-ending, unrecoverable, total social suicide in their ruthless, hyper-competitive, deeply cynical world. The utterly destroyed, deeply humiliated queen desperately, frantically, and pathetically attempts to completely deny the overwhelming, massive validity of the documents, sputtering wildly, sweating profusely, and screaming incoherently about forged signatures, malicious tabloid conspiracies orchestrated by Meghan Markle, and illegal, hostile corporate takeovers, completely, totally losing whatever tiny, pathetic shred of royal dignity she had left. But William simply, coldly, and wordlessly raises his hand, signaling the senior, highly decorated federal banking regulator to step forward to the microphone and calmly, officially, and loudly confirm to the entire, stunned, breathless, completely silent room that the late Queen's decree has already been completely, fully, and undeniably authenticated by the highest, most supreme legal courts in the land that very morning, completely, permanently, and thoroughly destroying any last, pathetic, desperate shred of deniability she frantically clung to. As the disgraced, utterly broken, completely humiliated woman is quietly, forcefully, and aggressively escorted out of the side entrance of the grand ballroom by her own, suddenly highly cooperative, heavily armed security detail, who immediately, instinctively recognized exactly who was truly paying their salaries now, entirely, permanently stripped of her massive, unearned titles, her sprawling, stolen global estates, and her completely fraudulent, totally manufactured power, the true, profound, terrifying brilliance of the entire, completely invisible trap finally, clearly comes into perfect, undeniable, crystal clear focus, revealing a level of long-term, institutional foresight, absolute psychological mastery, and true brotherly loyalty that is genuinely, absolutely staggering to behold for anyone who understands how incredibly dangerous power actually works at the absolute highest levels of the establishment. The explosive, world-stopping, entirely unprecedented climax of this completely invisible, incredibly high-stakes generational war, spectacularly, violently, and poetically unfolded during an incredibly lavish, highly photographed, obscenely expensive, invite-only aristocratic philanthropic gala hosted directly by Queen Camilla herself, inside the massive, historic, highly decorated Grand State Dining Room of Buckingham Palace. An event she had personally, arrogantly orchestrated specifically, loudly to publicly celebrate her own total, unquestioned, absolute dominance over the massive family empire, and to essentially permanently crown herself as the absolute greatest, most successful, totally untouchable power broker in the entire history of the modern British dynasty. The explosive, world-stopping, entirely unprecedented climax of this completely invisible, incredibly high-stakes generational war, spectacularly, violently, and poetically unfolded during an incredibly lavish, highly photographed, obscenely expensive, invite-only aristocratic philanthropic gala hosted directly by Queen Camilla herself, inside the massive, historic, highly decorated Grand State Dining Room of Buckingham Palace. An event she had personally, arrogantly orchestrated specifically, loudly to publicly celebrate her own total, unquestioned, absolute dominance over the massive family empire, and to essentially permanently crown herself as the absolute greatest, most successful, totally untouchable power broker in the entire history of the modern British dynasty. The explosive, world-stopping, entirely unprecedented climax of this completely invisible, incredibly high-stakes generational war, spectacularly, violently, and poetically unfolded during an incredibly lavish, highly photographed, obscenely expensive, invite-only aristocratic philanthropic gala hosted directly by Queen Camilla herself, inside the massive, historic, highly decorated Grand State Dining Room of Buckingham Palace. An event she had personally, arrogantly orchestrated specifically, loudly to publicly celebrate her own total, unquestioned, absolute dominance over the massive family empire, and to essentially permanently crown herself as the absolute greatest, most successful, totally untouchable power broker in the entire history of the modern British dynasty. The explosive, world-stopping, entirely unprecedented climax of this completely invisible, incredibly high-stakes generational war, spectacularly, violently, and poetically unfolded during an incredibly lavish, highly photographed, obscenely expensive, invite-only aristocratic philanthropic gala hosted directly by Queen Camilla herself, inside the massive, historic, highly decorated Grand State Dining Room of Buckingham Palace. An event she had personally, arrogantly orchestrated specifically, loudly to publicly celebrate her own total, unquestioned, absolute dominance over the massive family empire, and to essentially permanently crown herself as the absolute greatest, most successful, totally untouchable power broker in the entire history of the modern British dynasty. The explosive, world-stopping, entirely unprecedented climax of this completely invisible, incredibly high-stakes generational war, spectacularly, violently, and poetically unfolded during an incredibly lavish, highly photographed, obscenely expensive, invite-only aristocratic philanthropic gala hosted directly by Queen Camilla herself, inside the massive, historic, highly decorated Grand State Dining Room of Buckingham Palace. An event she had personally, arrogantly orchestrated specifically, loudly to publicly celebrate her own total, unquestioned, absolute dominance over the massive family empire, and to essentially permanently crown herself as the absolute greatest, most successful, totally untouchable power broker in the entire history of the modern British dynasty. The explosive, world-stopping, entirely unprecedented climax of this completely invisible, incredibly high-stakes generational war spectacularly, violently, and poetically unfolded during an incredibly lavish, highly photographed, obscenely expensive, invite-only aristocratic philanthropic gala hosted directly by Queen Camilla herself, inside the massive, historic, highly decorated Grand State Dining Room of Buckingham Palace. An event she had personally, arrogantly orchestrated specifically, loudly to publicly celebrate her own total, unquestioned, absolute dominance over the massive family empire, and to essentially permanently crown herself as the absolute greatest, most successful, totally untouchable power broker in the entire history of the modern British dynasty. The explosive, world-stopping, entirely unprecedented climax of this completely invisible, incredibly high-stakes generational war spectacularly, violently, and poetically unfolded during an incredibly lavish, highly photographed, obscenely expensive, invite-only aristocratic philanthropic gala hosted directly by Queen Camilla herself, inside the massive, historic, highly decorated Grand State Dining Room of Buckingham Palace. An event she had personally, arrogantly orchestrated specifically, loudly to publicly celebrate her own total, unquestioned, absolute dominance over the massive family empire, and to essentially permanently crown herself as the absolute greatest, most successful, totally untouchable power broker in the entire history of the modern British dynasty.